Thank you for this interaction. I just want to preface this by saying that your work has had a kind of deep and abiding impact on writing in South Asia. One of the things that, of course, struck me was the binary that you start out with, the negative and the positive. And we're very much in the era of digital photography and sort of taking on from other experiments within the so-called modernist history of photography, like cameraless photography. But I was sort of going to ask you about this binary in terms of a more geopolitics around your area of interest in photography. Can this binary be expanded upon? And I'm talking now not only with reference to, of course, the techno-material, the negative and the positive, but also in terms of the East and the West, what is considered material cultures from here and what is considered for them. Do you see lines of sight that have emerged through your scholarship, bridging sort of these two binaries in terms of a certain geopolitics?
Let's start with the big picture. I mean, one of the things that drew me to the idea of writing a book or a series of essays about the interaction of negative and positive was that binary in itself acted as a kind of metaphor for exactly all of the sorts of one and others that you've just touched on. So that, in one sense, you're talking about a very real, technical, material interaction that results in most analog photographs, and metaphorically, perhaps in digital photography too, with its sort of on-off, positive, negative, electronic flow. But in doing that, what I was really interested in doing was thinking about the discourse of photo history itself. So you focus in on this sort of micro issue, but what you're really talking about is all of the binary oppositions that have motivated that history up to this point, including the kind of ones you're talking about, the distance between East and West, for example. Now, I wouldn't say that my work is trying to bridge that gap, though, but more, for a start, I think first it's trying to acknowledge that we have this binary structure, and that if we're going to produce histories that don't simply replicate otherness, sexism, racism, colonialism, then we have to burrow into the very infrastructure of our own, the way we actually write our histories. So looking at negative and positive, I see that as just a first step, that actually acknowledging the complexity of that relationship, how it plays out in particular photographic practices, how it plays out across photography's history. And from there, it of course also infiltrates all sorts of other aspects of that history, including how, for example, South Asia, or my own place of origin, Australia and New Zealand, actually, what role do we play in these histories? We are always on the margins. Or, of course, like negatives, mostly repressed and forgotten, we're literally written out of history. We're just not in it. I think if you look across the whole breadth of my work up to this point, it's something that I frequently find myself doing, is going to something that history of photography usually considers to be on the margin. Vernacular photography is another example. And then trying to not so much shift the marginal into the center, but to complicate the relationship between the two. So that when I do exhibitions of vernacular photography, for example, I inevitably also include art photographs, because I don't want there to be this, I don't want to reiterate the division. I want to actually complicate the assumed distinction between those two things. And it's the same in this book. I really try to show that in many instances, it's hard to distinguish negatives from positives. The positive always presumes a negative, but in the earliest photographs, there was no distinction. A negative was a photograph. They were just called photographs. There was no real distinction made between them. And in the case of Talbot's earliest photographs, chemically, there is no distinction between them. A negative is exactly the same as a positive. It was made in the same way, using the same chemistry and the same substrate. And so when you start to burrow into the history in a little more detail, the sort of distinctions that we take for granted become much more difficult to sustain. And I would say that's the same for the sort of geopolitical question that you've just asked me. That if you start to write a history of this kind, it starts to, by inevitably, like, you don't even have to be self-conscious about it, it becomes global. Because photographs are then seen as things that are constantly being reproduced, that are constantly being disseminated, that are mobile objects, that national boundaries, which is the way histories have always been written up to this point, simply are permeable and cannot be sustained in the face of the realities of these histories. To give you an example, some colleagues of mine have just published a book, two Australian scholars, about a photographer named J.W. Newland, who was born in England, opened a daguerreotype studio in New Orleans in the United States, traveled through South America making daguerreotypes the whole time, then traveled across the Pacific and made daguerreotypes in Tahiti and Fiji, arrives in Australia, exhibits 200 of these daguerreotypes along with a magic lantern slide show, makes a whole lot of photographs in Australia, and then he moves to India and ends up in Calcutta. And he dies there in 1857, having opened a studio in Calcutta. Now, this is the history of photography. This guy's an itinerant. He's obviously a British colonial, but the whole world is his business model, if you like. And histories that want to say, oh, is he Australian, or is he English, or is he British, or I mean, is he Indian? You guys can tell me. But this is it. Our histories have to be as complicated as the practice of photography itself. So to add to the story, something I've already spoken to you about. So Newland, travels around the world, is basically a global citizen, makes photographs wherever he goes, and takes those photographs with him to each of the next venues. Probably, we assume, those 200 daguerreotypes of South America and Tahiti ended up in India. Who knows what happened to them? And while he's there, one of the people he photographs is a woman named Anne Hinder, who was born in Calcutta, and whose son was born in Calcutta. And that son then emigrated to Australia, and it was my grandfather's grandfather. So here we have a kind of thing where here I am, the historian, telling you about J.W. Newland, who it turns out photographed my great-great-great-great-grandmother in India, to which I'm somehow, very distantly connected by this means. I mean, photography is one of those media that you cannot confine to national boundaries, and you cannot confine to these east-west, one other kinds of narrative structures. So I see this book, as a first step, first to talking about this, fairly simple opposition of negative and positive, but then second, breaking down all these kinds of barriers and starting to open up the history of photography to the reality of how photography actually has been experienced and practiced, through its 200 years.
That's sort of in a nutshell, the global history of what photography is and can do.
Well, I think what, what I'd say this, what drives my work is the idea that the way we actually do history already has all of these politics embedded in it. In other words, I'm not only interested in the content of the history, but in the way histories are structured, the kinds of questions they ask, the kinds of things that they've taken for granted without really questioning them. What I hope my work will leave as a legacy is a constant questioning of those things we assume to be just natural, including the division between East and West that you've already mentioned.
I have to say, I was looking at one of your conversations and where you cited John Murray's work. I sort of liked the way in which you talked about how the negative was kind of mediated. So it was never a kind of ruling singularity about having the negative as it was. It was always played and sort of tampered with and made into a kind of hybrid object of its own.
Yeah, it's only in the early 20th century that the negative becomes a kind of sacred object that cannot be manipulated. I mean, Murray is a great example of a photographer who did anything he felt needed to be done to make the final print a better object. So he would paint his negatives, he would bleach his negatives, he would manipulate them in all sorts of ways. And I think part of the problem for historians has been we've tended to take a 20th century aesthetic norm and projected it back and measure the 19th century against it. But it's time to recognize that in the 19th century, the purity of the negative was not the kind of issue that it became in the 20th century.
No, I mean, one of the main questions I've been wanting to ask you is also sort of very much around this idea that you also, in your conversation with Ponteveta, you say that this process of excavating the history of photography itself is going to disembowel modernity, right? And the project of modernity. And so I think I wanted to ask you to give us a little bit of more of a sense of how the image world itself has this political charge, right? And it has sort of been operating through various, we know of the power structures through which it has been operating, but now as we come to the digital world, but yet, of course, modernity still continues to sort of operate through images. And so if you could sort of open that up a little bit more.
one of the reasons that photography is an interesting thing to study is that it is the very embodiment of industrial capitalism. Its emergence occurs with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the advent of the kind of consumer capitalism that we take for granted today. That was its context of emergence, and that has been its milieu ever since. And so in many ways, photography is the very embodiment of modern culture. And that continues right up to the present with digital photography. With the shift from an industrial culture to information society and a digital culture, photography has shifted with it. So the study of photography has always been a study of modernity in all of its various forms. And so again, I see that the kind of work I do myself, it's to look at photography as kind of a metaphoric activity where what you're really trying to do is critique modern culture in general. I've had students at the moment writing about the environmental impact of photographs, that every time I send a JPEG from here to you, it's the same amount of electricity as running a small refrigerator or something like that. Like there's all sorts of hidden elements of the digital culture that we now live in, both political, economic, and environmental, that I think we still have to interrogate. And that is part of the project of writing histories of photography, I think. To critique the digital photograph and all of the infrastructure that makes it possible is to critique modern society as a whole.
I've really been kind of drawn to your work around the cameraless photograph as well. And I don't know if you've read this author, Winfried Gerling, who has theorized from some of your ideas about the cameraless into coming into sort of the digital photograph and then the screenshot or the image of the screen as a cameraless image making. And he kind of paraphrases you in saying that this kind of photography can bring the margins into the center, can sort of dispose of the perspectival sort of hegemony and things like that. But of course, the digital space is itself a different space. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that, because I don't know if it does this thing of collapsing the humanist gaze so much.
Let's put it this way. It's an interesting conceit to think about and push around. The idea that if you abandon the perspectival space that is imposed on photographs by the camera and explore, you might say, a more primal element of photography, which is simply the light sensitivity of surfaces, that you thereby displace that kind of humanist, compulsory humanist look at the world. I think it's a nice idea to think about. But I wouldn't want to say, okay, then the work is done and we can move on. But it's a nice idea to think about. Now, I haven't read the person you mentioned, but whether taking things off a screen is quite the same. When I did my own book on the history of cameraless photography, I only included digital examples where people were using basically a flatbed scanner. But one could argue that even a flatbed scanner actually is a kind of a camera, has a perspectival bias built into it. So, it's like every project of that kind, it's a bit of a fiction as to exactly what cameraless is and what cameraless isn't. I tried to patrol the borders a little bit, but I wouldn't want to pretend that it's completely a pure and cut and dried distinction between the camera made and the cameraless. And the other element I think that you're touching on is that as soon as you make images using any of the technology, including the technology that we're making use of now, one necessarily is becoming complicit with a much bigger political economy that one needs to be sensitive to.
One of the things I wanted to ask you in, sort of coming back a little bit to sort of different histories of photography, something that you touch upon is the sort of more tenuous field I find more and more of pictorialism. It's sort of in India, one of those areas that became heavily, political without sort of knowing it was doing so. What's happened over here to a great extent is there's also been an appropriation, I would say, of individuals, of notions of race, of notions of what is considered aesthetically more beautiful, coming into belie sort of this trope called pictorialism, the sort of meeting of light, shade, and shadow. I just wanted to ask you whether you found it as complicated as it's beginning, to turn up in different photo histories, because the more you appropriate that image, the more you try to create I suppose, a kind of trend. This binary sort of embeds itself, whether you like it or not, of what is good and bad, of what is mediated and what is not mediated. Is there a way around it?
Well, I think this is, again, where people like we three have a role, because I would say, there's no simple response to your question other than to insist on the criticality of one's questioning. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there are sort of formulaic answers. You have to look at each instance in its own context and interrogate it as deeply as you can, and that this is the only way to proceed. In other words, I'm not sure that you can easily say, Cameron good, Cameron bad. One has to look at each instance in its own context and look at it closely.
Yeah.
In the negative positive book, you mentioned this word pictorialism, which is a complicated word, but I talk about Gursky's work, Andreas Gursky's work, as a contemporary form of pictorialism, because it's, again, a constructed image and so on and so forth. And even in the case of Gursky's work in the book, I suggest some of it seems to me to be completely complicit with contemporary capitalism, and others of it might be read as, in a more interesting way. So even in the case of a sort of fairly singular practice, where he's doing more or less the same kinds of things technically, some of the images he produces, I think, open up the world to an interesting conversation, and other images simply reiterate
2010
capitalist relationships of the sort that we might want to contest. I was looking at, and I talk about in particular the Oceans series.
Yes.
In part because, I come from Australia and New Zealand, and one of those photographs, which was bought by the Auckland Art Gallery, our largest art gallery in New Zealand, shows basically the Pacific Ocean with Australia and New Zealand just on one edge, framing this otherwise vast space of nothingness. So, of course, it fitted my theme, because in a way that nothingness is a kind of negative space. So this is a photograph about negative space. And it's interesting to think that Oceania, the part of the world that Australia and New Zealand occupy, is the only continent that's named after a body of water rather than a landmass. And that his photographs sort of open up the fact that this otherness, this negative space, is in fact part of the identity of those people who have inhabited that part of the world for centuries. So, there's a photograph that can initiate an interesting conversation, precisely again about one and other, about land and water and the relative value of these things. Other photographs, for example, of the inside of an Amazon warehouse, I find it harder to find a criticality in them. I find it to be simply the pictorial doppelganger of Amazon, placeless, omnipotent, all-powerful, inexorable, almost unimaginable just because of the sheer scale of the enterprise. And all of those words could equally be used for Gursky's photograph of the Amazon warehouse. So as I say, I think different photographic projects have different things to tell us about the world.
Yeah, I was sort of referencing actually something quite particular with respect to pictorialism, and I was looking at actually how it sort of, at least here, I'm talking now specifically with reference to India, how it kind of embedded itself with photojournalism. I would say in the post-independence, era, just after independence, there was a kind of coming together. And one of the reasons I thought about it is because of your referencing of Life magazine in the essay that you sent us with respect to the work of the Swedish photographer, if I'm not mistaken, right? And he produces that one image in Life magazine. Similarly, over here, Life magazine, sort of with Sunil Jana's work, while he was looking at the famines that were taking place post-independence, or, especially him associated with the Communist Party over here, began to sort of create these sort of master narratives using the trope of pictorialism, using the trope of the human body as a certain kind of body. If there are other critiques, to sort of take place, even of the image that you mentioned of the photographer who's looking at his watch, but is holding a negative and a positive image, I'm wondering whether that was staged enough, the sort of understanding of its fidelity to the truth claims that it might make. and so on. And I think pictorialism is a lovely example by which we are very much pushed away from that truth. Even though we try to read it maybe as something that is in front of us, it's actually all that's not in front of us.
Don't you think that the problem that you're putting your finger on here, it's not so much to do with the photographer or even the photograph. It has more to do with our own naivety, that we want photographs to be truthful, and we're always shocked, even now in the digital age, when it's shown that they've been manipulated or constructed in some way. But that shock is a result of our own desire to find truth, rather than the fact that photographs inevitably are going to give it to us. I mean, anybody who's looked at photography for more than 5 minutes or practiced photography themselves knows that every photograph is a manipulation of one sort or another. The sequence that you're mentioning, taken by Nielsen in the Congo in 1948, was obviously taken in collaboration with the photographer. And so everything you see is posed and set up and obviously lit to be photographed. Indeed, you couldn't, I mean, what we see in the one you mentioned is the Congolese photographer holding up a negative with a piece of positive paper against it in his darkroom. But obviously, if the lights are on and he's being photographed, that image is going to be fogged. So obviously what we're seeing is fake, if you like. But on another sense, you could say it does speak to a larger truth, which is this man is a photographer. He works in a darkroom that more or less looks like this, and this is what he does in that darkroom. So the photograph is fake, but what it tells us about is true. Another example would be the famous Robert Capa photograph of the Republican soldier being killed or shot during the Spanish Civil War. You know, there's a lot of debate. Is the photograph real? Was it staged? It seems irrelevant to me because soldiers were shot and killed during the Spanish Civil War. That's what that photograph is meant to represent. In that sense, it represents truth. Whether or not the photograph itself has been staged seems a bit beside the point. Of course, many people are exercised about it. Why? Because a lot of people have a deep investment in the authenticity, the truth value of the photograph. Now, so my question would be, why? Why are we so concerned that the photograph must be true? What is it about our relationship to photographs where we get upset when it's proved to us or shown to us that somehow the photograph has been staged or manipulated in some other way?